Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all participants joining us from different parts of the world. The Urban Governance Research Network, UGovern, is delighted to welcome you all to the second Connect 21 webinar on blurred boundaries and deal making in urban real estate development. My name is Champaka, and I'm accompanied by Sarah Uzagul and Nagwa Kadi, who lead research at UGovern. At the outset, let me share a brief overview of UGovern, the Connect 21 project, and the idea behind today's session. UGovern is an academic platform to build, share, and communicate research activities in the field of urban governance and planning. The platform was initiated by Professor Dr. Tuna Tassenkok within the framework of her chair of urban governance and planning at the University of Amsterdam. An overarching problem the UGovern platform underscores is the challenge of collaboration in urban planning practice and research. The main aim of UGovern is to connect academics, practitioners, and communities who work in the field of urban governance to create an interactive platform to discuss and collaborate on research. UGovern members each belong to a research chapter, a specific research chapter, which are named after research fields in which UGovern members publish and collaborate. Today's event is connected to the UGovern Planning and Property chapter. Connect 21 is an excellent example of the types of collaboration that UGovern Networks aims to encourage. The idea of the project stems from the personal experiences and work at the intersection of planning, real estate investment, and development of Sarah, Nagwa, Tuna, and myself, and together we set up this project. We observed several knowledge gaps between planning and real estate scholarship, which fails to adequately incorporate insights from both disciplines, between planning and real estate practitioners who collaborate in urban development with relationships driven by misaligned values and goals, misunderstandings, generalization of assumptions and stereotypes, and between researchers on the one hand and practitioners on the other, whose domains of knowledge production do not converge effectively enough to bring about sustainable development and good forms of development. We would like to underline that close collaboration with real estate practitioners is rare in planning studies and even frowned upon. Also, opportunities for knowledge exchange and networking between researchers from multiple disciplines and professions are limited. Therefore, the Connect 21 project brings together scholars researching on urban planning and real estate, network organizations from Africa, Europe, Latin America. Institutional partners of the Connect 21 project are the African Real Estate Society, the European Real Estate Society, PhD Network, the Latin American Real Estate Society, the Young Academics Network, and their representatives. Our project has been generously funded by the University of Amsterdam's Center for Urban Studies. Furthermore, we have a number of renowned academics and practitioners who joined our project as individual partners. Collaboratively, we have developed 4 public webinars and 2 early career seminars. We've had an excellent start to the first webinar, where we discussed uncertainty, change, and real estate dynamics, and are excited about the discussion today in our second webinar on questions pertaining to negotiated decisions between states and markets and the real estate sector. And who really decides is the point that we're really going to deliberate on today. Today, we welcome eminent international experts from academia and practice who will debate the effects of COVID-19 on blurred boundaries and deal making in cities, with focus on urban real estate development. Planners and real estate industry actors are dependent on each other for financing, regulating, and implementing urban real estate development. In this process, boundaries between public and private sectors, roles and responsibilities that each needs to assume are often blurred, involving informal alliances or deals struck between opaque nexus of state market agencies. The COVID-19 pandemic has accentuated this trend. Cities are confronted with a growing number of issues: inadequate housing supplies, deficient amenities, property vacancies, inner city retail challenges, and so on. And these can only be solved through close collaboration between planning authorities and real estate firms. Are the planning authorities and real estate industry mutually responding to one another to develop in public interest? Who decides when these two parties with divergent interests come together? To what extent are new forms of collaboration emerging, or are long-standing alliances and disputes simply continuing as business as usual? And what are the short-term and long-term consequences of changing interdependencies that are emerging and ways of deal-making between planners and real estate industry actors? Joining us to deliberate on these various critical questions are Emma Street. She's Associate Professor of Urban Policy and Governance at Henley Business School, University of Reading. Welcome, Emma. She is interested in the values, assumptions, decisions, and processes that shape the way that urban environments look, function, and are governed, and is currently working on projects relating to reform of the English planning system and the changing planning profession. We have with us Francois Veroli. Welcome, Francois. He's a property economist with over 20 years of experience in advising public as well as private entities, and associate professor at the University of Cape Town, where he's also the director of Urban Real Estate Research Unit. His research interests are in the fields of urban land economics, property finance, and portfolio management. We have with us Eric Hubrechts. Welcome, Eric. He is a senior architect and regional urban planner who's in charge of the international and European affairs of Urban and Environmental Planning Agency of Greater Paris region and the French representative of ISOCARP. He has vast experience in the field of urban and regional planning as expert and team leader at Algiers, Beirut, Cairo, Ethiopia, Istanbul, Mongolia, Rio de Janeiro, Mumbai, the Paris region, cities in Saudi Arabia, and at Tripoli at Libya, having prepared projects at local level, sub-metropolitan level, regional level, as well as national scales. Welcome all of you. Just a quick note that this session is being recorded. The audience will be muted at all times. We encourage you to please submit your questions and engage in the discussion via the question answer box or the chat. I will monitor the discussions and questions and bring them onto the discussion forum later on. Over to you, Emma.
Am I starting, Shamba, or yes?
Over to you, Francois.
Thank you. Thank you.
I've stopped sharing the screen.
Let me just share my screen, and we should be fine. Let me just see. Shamba, can you confirm? Yeah, you can hear me. Okay, good. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. And in the 10 minutes that I have, which is never an easy task for an academic who's used to double periods, but I will do my very best to do so. As you'll see, I'm also taking a view not only as an economist, but also as an economist who operates in an emerging country context, and hence the African Real Estate Society. So in the next 10 minutes, I will do four things. Largely, I just want to take a view from an economist, and I think how we think about these things from an economic perspective. I just want to touch on the institutional perspective, and I think it's an important issue, especially in an emerging country context. We often talk of property returns and the implication that that has in the negotiations with cities, but let's also talk about risk. I want to bridge the gap to the ESG and thinking that is taking place at the moment, which one can argue is controversial by itself, and then a few words on decision making. So I think my first slide is an apology of almost being an economist, in the sense that I think we got it wrong. I think that with neoclassical economics, land disappeared out of economics, and we've lost something in that process. Pick up any economics textbook and you will very quickly see that the land is discussed once in the first chapter and then never again. Land and capital seems to fall into the same category. And I think that has implications in our discussions, because I think it leads to a type of economics that has found itself also into business schools and in property studies, where that link with urban issues, land issues, is still there through urban economics, through urban geography, but not in the heart of economics. And I think that we have an opportunity in the next few years through ecological economics and the way land economics is moving to redress that. And I think that that redressing will have an implication on the behavior that we will see of the different agents in the story. So yes, as we all know, the discussion is moving along from a focus on produced capital, the typical capital that we come across in economics, to human capital and natural capital. But I think the interesting point is not so, is yes, we need to take note of the different types of capital, and we need to rewire economics to some degree to get there. But I think it's also, what is equally important here is also how we use that capital, how we use our natural human and produced capital to reach certain outputs, and how we negotiate the use of the capital that we have. As somebody said to me recently, Adam Smith got it right when he called it the wealth of nation. It is about the capital that we have and not the income flows that we have, and that we've missed the understanding behind that. So what do we need to do? I think the first thing which is going to be important in our discussion is that we start understanding each other. I think there's a literature that is evolving at the moment. And I've put one here, exploring the notional property developer. Who is this property developer? Do we understand the property developer? What sort of decisions are being made by them, and what influences the behavior? That you don't have policies that completely that sort of believe that property developers are reading integrated development plans on a Friday afternoon, you know, and not quite. So I think that becomes important. But I think the other issue, which is also important, and I've just seen the recent work by Francis Bill coming out on risk. And I think that the lack of trust also influences risk, how we perceive risk. And if you believe that there is a relationship between risk and return, I think that becomes important. So I think the building of trust will have an important role in how we go forward. The easy version of this is to say the following, that there's a circle between corporate leadership, transparent innovation, education, and we get that flow going. But that flow relies on institutions. It relies on that level of trust. And I think what we see in many emerging countries where we don't have the institutions to build on this. And I think that's half the problems and where they start. This is one that I always like showing because it does relate to a particular issue. And that is, for this, all of us in the built environment, we're taught the following. You start with town planning, you then have service, building, and occupation, and our institutions work in that direction. In many places of the world, where those institutions are weak, it happens in exactly the opposite direction. You start by occupying, you then build, you then get frustrated because there are no services, and the planner is the last one to come to the fore. And I think where it becomes interesting is that our failure in our institutions to go down one direction means that we go up the other direction. The property market doesn't stop. It doesn't wait. In many countries, housing shortages are such that they carry on at a very fast pace. We've got a choice in which direction we want things to start happening. So I am seeing a positive outcome here. And I mean, this is excellent work. And I think which was touched on the very first Connect 21 that we had, where we discussed what's behind this particular document, the S in ESG. And I think what is important is that if we take an emerging country context, I would change it to S, G, and E at the end. Unless we build the social capital, things. And so, yes, in a more industrialized country, you can start very quickly with the E because the SNG, I don't want to say has sorted, but the institutions are there. So how are we moving forward with this? I think that there is a progression. I mean, if we move to the left of this graphic, we have the traditional. And then I think if we moved into the ESG space, it becomes interesting with a lot of focus on the E. The SNG is where we've got the problem. We haven't got the metrics. With the taxonomies are being built in the EU and many other places as well. And I think that until we can get that right, those discussions between the private and public sector on the SNG becomes problematic. How do you get the metrics into a remuneration committee of a building company? How do you get that right? And I think where the most interesting is happening is for many, the ESG is just a risk mitigation game. Whether it has an impact or not, finally, nice. But I think that the impact, linking ESG into the SDGs, the UN Habitat SDG, that's going to be the impact. And often we're still missing the right-hand side of this equation. We stop with the ESG. No matter the impact, the company now has a good ESG rating. Yes, you've mitigated your risk on regulations. You've mitigated your risk from a financial perspective. And there we enter the world of green bonds, social bonds, which I think is going to give us an opportunity. The other opportunity that we also have is that those negotiations will come to the fore increasingly because in many countries, the only game at the moment is the residential game. Offices are oversupplied, industrial, yes, the logistics looks fairly good, but I think we're coming short on the residential, and we will see the negotiations around the residential sector growing. So where do we find ourselves? Value capture becomes the name of the game. We've played value capture at one level, which has been problematic in many emerging countries. Too complicated, can't do it. Paying infrastructure through land, value capture, nice idea. The institutions often are not in place. And but we're entering into an interesting world, which I'm actually involved at the moment, and that is an inclusionary housing policy, where I think in the inclusionary housing policy, we have an opportunity on value capture, which becomes a true possibility. There is in those extra rights, unleashing the social outcome of those densities and and the negotiations that can happen between the public and private sectors. I'm happy to talk about that, but I'm also realizing that I'm running short of my 10 minutes. So calculators are in there. We know, and I think there's an emerging literature around the financialization of planning, around the use of returns in determining the way forward. But I think this is going to be a very interesting place around inclusionary housing, where I think we will be seeing the negotiations between cities and the built environment. And then finally, let's be careful what we promise and what we do. This has been a pet topic of mine, of the fantastical cities being developed across Africa. I've got a picture book, which I would love to show you all one day, of project after project, which are negotiated to represent the modern state. We call it the Dubai of Africa. We call it the Singapore of Africa. We call it all sorts of things. And there is agreement between the public sector and the developer in those, but at the cost of land, of lower income, affordable housing, often. And in this particular case, the picture on top is the proposal. This is what was negotiated and agreed on. At the bottom is what we got. Now, maybe at the bottom is what we should have had, always have had, but it just shows that the negotiations that we undertake can lead us in strange directions as well, with different motives behind that. Thank you very much. I'm, I think, a few seconds over my time, but hopefully not too much. But I hope that I've been able to bring together some of the issues that we're dealing with, the opportunities. And I think we're entering into a very interesting world of the relationship between the public sector planners and the private sector. Either it will be pushed through ESG and the public sector will not be capable to deal with it, which has its own risks, or we will find a way forward with the institutions that we develop. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jean-Paul.
Thank you very much, Francois. That was very important. I myself have underscored that risk needs to be central to all decision making. You've added a very important component of trust, particularly in the emerging economies context, where decisions are made both in formal and largely informal ways as well. So thank you very much for that. Over to Emma for her presentation, please. I will share screen.
Thank you, Jean-Paul. I think you're going to pull up my slides. Excuse me. Oh, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, if you can just, well, we might have the little barrier down the side because it's a PDF, never mind. Okay, thanks very much for the invitation to join the session today. In the next 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about urban regeneration practice. I'm going to do that from a UK perspective, so hopefully there'll be some nice complementarities with what Francois has covered. I want to argue that that's got some distinct characteristics. Some of those are real and some of them are claimed, and sometimes there's both going on. That sets it apart from what might be termed mainstream real estate development. And I think that means that those distinctions mean it offers a useful lens onto which to reflect on some of the themes of the session. And particularly, I want to pick up on those themes of collaboration and interdependency in a general sense, but also some of the deal making that sits at the heart of those themes. I think it's quite important, if we can, to get at some of the specificities of these things. Urban regeneration is clearly a broad church. The abstract identifies a number of problems and issues, many of which regeneration purports to address, actually. Sometimes it can, sometimes it can't. A lot of the time these claims are overinflated. But I'm going to be focusing on some of those that are highlighted around town centres in particular as part of that. Of course, I'm going to have to generalise today. I've only got 10 minutes. So let's begin with one characteristic that I think has got some kind of shared resonance with those redevelopments that use the label of regeneration. Firstly, that's public sector leadership. So that's particularly in terms of brokering collaborations to then deliver regeneration, but also in terms of making the case for regeneration. That's one thing that I want to look at first of all. Could I have the next slide, please, Jean-Paul? Thank you. So hopefully you can see now. Can you see? I'm struggling to see what you're seeing. Bracknell, yes, you can. That's great. So this is Bracknell, a town in southeastern England. It was designated in 1949, so it's one of the post-war new towns in the UK. Around 80,000 population. It's in the economically buoyant Thames Valley region, around 30 miles from London. Now, because of the way that regeneration is typically delivered in the UK context, in partnership between public and private sectors, making the case for regeneration often involves identifying, or at least making visible, it may be there, it may be latent, actually it was in the Bracknell case, a commercial development opportunity. So that's increasingly part of the deal-making role that local authorities are finding themselves in. So the regeneration, as opposed to perhaps mainstream real estate development opportunity, may be more risky than typically we might see in development contexts. There might be lower projected investment returns that perhaps might only become feasible or viable by retaining those assets over the longer term. So there are distinctions here, but that case, that commercial opportunity still needs to be made, and it's increasingly falling to the public sector, often using elements of the planning system to actually make that case. Now, in Bracknell, the need for regeneration was actually pretty clear. You might be able to see from this picture here, the town centre was designed essentially to the tastes of the 1940s and also to cater for the needs of the 1940s population. One issue that I created in a regeneration context was that it was uniformly ageing, poor quality public realm. People essentially were voting with their feet. They were doing their shopping and spending their money somewhere else. Like other new towns in the UK, Bracknell also had an image problem. So it regularly appeared in these quite tongue-in-cheek crap town polls, excuse my language. But the sense really was quite material. It was basically of an unloved place that needed to do something quite drastic to get its kind of mojo back. Now, one benefit of Bracknell's new town past was that most of its town ownership was in the ownership of just 2 landlords. Now the Global Property Investment Management Fund's Legal and General Property and Schroders UK Property Fund. And essentially their assets just weren't performing as they might because the town centre just wasn't being used to its potential. So Bracknell Forest Council, the local authority in charge here, was basically to bring together the need for regeneration along with making recognise that commercial opportunity for regeneration. And they did that in a fairly standard practice way by creating a regeneration vision. And then to use the language of regeneration, there is a particular language around this, taking the landowners, the residents, the existing businesses with them on that journey of developing and delivering that vision. So can you go to the next slide, please, Shampaka? So you should be able to now see an image from the second phase of the town centre regeneration. So this is the lexicon phase. It basically was the kind of big delivery of that 21st century town vision. It's a mixed-use scheme, including 1 million square feet of leisure and retail space, opened in autumn 2017. This was a comprehensive regeneration scheme, another word that often crops up in regeneration practice. Essentially what it saw was most of the town centre demolished and redeveloped in phases and then connected with, you can see these kind of semi-covered streets here, anchored then by high-end retail department store Fenwick, as well as more kind of standard fare, high street fare, such as Marks and Spencer's, and then a kind of complementary food, beverage and entertainment offer. The lexicon was more than 30 years in the making, and it also, importantly, I think, for the lessons that I think it can draw for us for our current context of crisis, it weathered the global financial crisis. And that's where I think some of the useful lessons about collaboration and independency lie, particularly thinking forward now about, well, what might emerge going forward from urban development. Can I have the next slide, please? So how did it happen? Well, collaboration was critical, and not just in a general sense. That was here. So there were people working together in good nature in pursuit of a shared goal and vision, but there was also specific collaborative deals that were done here. There were compromises that were made, risks that were judged and then taken. Some specific examples. Bracknell Forest Council developed an outline planning application in the early 2000s, and that ran alongside a comprehensive master planning exercise, again led by the council, which helped get around a rather tricky and somewhat uncollaborative problem. And that was the fact that the 2 town centre owners, asset owners, had until that point been pursuing 2 rival development applications. So what that master planning exercise, that public sector led exercise helped articulate further was that regeneration vision. And it essentially then gave the private sector players the confidence to progress their involvement as part of a joint venture. And it was Bracknell Regeneration Partnership, that joint vehicle, venture vehicle, that delivered the lexicon. Second thing that I think helps us think about what collaboration might look in the context of ongoing crises, and unfortunately I think that's what we're looking at going forward, thinking particularly about the climate emergency. I really like the use of the term in the session abstract here of interdependency. I think that's really apt. I think for me it captures something additional, an additional sense of fragility that words like partnership and collaboration, they get kind of bandied about, they're a bit wishy-washy. They don't always convey that fragility. I think interdependency helps us theoretically get further towards that. Here, I want to just briefly talk about the council's handling of the global financial crisis. So I mentioned that this development weathered that storm. This struck an absolutely critical moment for the scheme. So the development agreement was about to go unconditional. Basically, there was no going back from that. The town centre was about to be demolished. What the GFC did was prompt concerns more generally in the real estate sector about the future of retail, about what town centres were for, how assets were going to perform over the medium to longer term. Essentially, one of the landowners looked at their assets and was reviewing whether to dispose of those. And the 6-month period that followed was basically one of risk, assessment. It was about deal making. It was about invoking some of that shared trust that Francois, you talked about, that had been generated carefully and invested in over decades. Essentially, the local authority put together a rescue package that had real financial, material content to it. That enabled the investors to remain with the scheme. It effectively unlocked the delivery of the regeneration plans. And it's a concrete example, if you excuse the pun, of the deal making that is done between public and private sectors, particularly to make regeneration deliverable in a time of crisis. Just to draw together some reflections about the current crisis, this kind of deal making, I think, is inevitably going to become more important. Those traditional kind of retail-led models of development that guided the regeneration of UK town centres for 20 years or more, including the lexicon, it's still a retail-led scheme, they look increasingly undeliverable. And perhaps they didn't give us what we wanted from our town centres anyway. So there's a kind of moment, an opportunity for reflection there. Just a couple of very quick examples. If I could go to the next slide, please. This is Reading Town Centre, where you can see, according to a local letting agent, what we're seeing is new collaborations, potentially new interdependencies forged in this crisis kind of context. Independent retailers stepping in where chain stores have failed. A lot of that happening in the UK context. As an aside, the picture here is of the Oracle shopping centre. That's now being, one of the department stores has gone bust. They're now talking about putting a bowling alley in there. So there's an interesting little aside about reuse. Another example that recently came across my radar is the example of Pool. Legal in General are the shopping centre owners there. They've effectively agreed to a rent waiver, no startup fees for independent retailers for the next 2 years. Very much couched in the term, and I think there's connections here with what Francois was saying about the non-economic or the beyond the economic value about long-term kind of vibrancy and diversity of our town centres. For me, it raises some really interesting questions about what are the new interdependencies here? Who's dependent on whom? It's very much couched in terms of the independent retailers have got something to gain here. But actually, are we not looking at those asset managers, those investors, those landlords effectively getting something from an asset that otherwise is valueless? Nobody wants to see an empty unit in a town centre. So I think there's some very interesting kind of negotiations and dependencies being forged here. Finally, one thing I haven't said much about is the role of planning in all of this. I have to do that. That's part of my kind of reason for being here. Essentially, I think it's a really difficult question. Basically, what is the role for planning systems, the planning profession more broadly, in this kind of unknowable, maybe even unplannable future? Sadly, I think we're going to see waves of crisis. We're going to see new kind of uncertainties as a result of that. At the moment, I think we're still very much in the short-term crisis response. It's hard to read too much into it. But I do think there's the potential, like Francois, I'm also a little bit optimistic here, to see a more meaningful appraisal of what value is in a town centre context as my particular focus. That might be permanently shelving town centre regeneration models that actually didn't serve us very well. They didn't get us the kinds of diverse town centre uses that we really want. I do think even if we are now in the short-term planning stage, we're going to see cycles of crisis. And so the planning system has got to come to grips with this, because inevitably then we're going to need planning to maybe provide some of that certainty in an uncertain future if we're to get at the kind of uses that we need from our town centres and urban environments more broadly over the short and long term. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Emma, for the rich presentation. Several new concepts that you've brought forth, including unpacking the whole concept of interdependence, focus on long-term uncertainty. Over to Eric, please, for the discussion.
Yes, this is a difficult task with these two presentations, which are very different, with very different approaches. So I try to pick some ideas in the different presentation and to give some direction and to ask the speakers some questions. I retain different things from the, of course, from the economy, which is central. In fact, we have Francois show different things which are very, very important, which is the for the global economy was the loss of connection with the land, in different manner, because the value of the assets of the financial economy is huge today, but it's reaching or more important now with the real estate, perhaps. And in fact, but if we want to make a better connection between these two fields, which is the stock exchange market and or the financial assets and the land and real estate, we can say that in fact there is a very big connection between these two domains. What I heard from the economists is that this kind of financial assets are investing in land and real estate and their urban services on about 9 or 10% of the assets. So the link is there. And when this financial economy is increasing, the financial capacity from these assets is increasing for cities or for real estate or for on land. And so in that point, we can consider that the effect of big crises like the 2008 crisis or the COVID crisis now increase the monetary mass globally. And we know that the stock exchange market increased at the same level with the monetary mass. So in fact, this big crisis increased the capacity of investment in cities. And so this is an important point to have in mind. So today there is more capacity for the private sector from the financial economy to invest in cities. Is it good or not? There is a lot of debate on the financialization of cities because these assets are creating different effect like inflation in cities, and but in some part of cities on the where these assets wants to invest, which are the CBDs, the main urban services for water supply, where there is a possible return without too much risk, and they will not invest too much in affordable housing. They will go to luxury apartments, they will go to shopping malls or airports, transportation sometimes, etc. So this have an effect on the real estate market inside cities. And at the same time, when we say that there is a big difference between the revenue of the population and the price of housing in a lot of cities, when you have an increase of around 7% per year in Paris or in London, and with a stable revenue increase of price of real estate, and you have a quasi-stable revenue of the population, the average population, average revenue of the population, you see the gap increase, and it is more and more difficult. This have an effect of the reduction of the population in the center part of Paris or London, because they are too expensive, or in Vancouver or New York, the same. And this push the population in the outskirts. So we can say it is better balanced, but in the same time, the outskirts, there is less amenities, less infrastructure, less equipment. And so, so this create condition to have new need for investment in public facilities and public equipment in the outskirts. So this creates new needs for investment. So it's interesting for the private sector, perhaps, but this creates more financial problems to finance this public infrastructure that we need. So this there is a lot of connection between these two domains, and with an increase of probably increase of the management of cities that are changing from time to time because of this the effect of the crisis on the global economy. The other point which was I want to focus on is the when Francois says that the town planning and service building and occupation is a process. This is a process of planning, but in fact, a lot of place use a reverse process, and you think about the informal settlements in cities, and in fact the informal production of cities, it's a historical phenomenon, and it's covering today more than 50% of the urban production worldwide. And in fact, we have, so it's more in South Asia, more in Africa, but it is the place where the population increased more today than in Europe, in Americas, or in the post-Soviet countries, or in China. And so, so this is very interesting, because we are, when it is informal, it is completely private. So, and there is no relation, or very few relation, or it is a reverse relation. There is few collaboration with the public sector. So it could be considered as an extreme, but this is half of the urban production in the world today. And so we can have a gradation between this informal production and to the formal production that we have in developed countries, or in the most sophisticated system that we have to produce, or to produce urban regeneration in European countries, or to produce new towns in some place, which is the formal way to manage cities. So here we have the range of the discussion is huge between the totally private, which is the informal, and with this integration of the between the public and the private system. So very interesting points to have in mind. I like also the very important question of the risk and return for the private sector. Who is managing the risk? Generally, the private sector limit its risk and asks the public sector to support the risk, or to reduce their own risk. So the risk is supported by the community, or by the public sector, and we can increase the capacity of the private sector by reducing their risk, by giving some guarantees from the public sector, which will be paid if there is any problem by the tax system, so by the population. So there is a kind of, the return is for the private sector, and the risk is for the public sector. The guarantee is supported by the public sector, so by the population. So if we take this into account, we have in mind that this relation, this discussion between the planning, the regulation, and the collaboration with the public and the private sector is this balance between the risk and return. How to support to have more investment, because there is much more financial capacity today than never in the history, and it is supported by the public sector, by the quantitative easing is supported by the federal banks, or by the European Bank, or etc. So it is supported by the private, the public sector to develop the financial assets, and so we know that the money is there, because the choice we are doing today is to give more and more capacity to the private sector, and after that we say, oh, the public sector should discuss and be more flexible to attract this private investment in the city. This is the question. Huh? And so there is and so the main question we should have in mind is how to reach the social needs, or the economic and social and environmental well-being, which was pointed by Francois, and in fact it is, if we want to reach it, it is not automatic by the financial assets to do that. And if we don't regulate, we see what happened in cities with empty apartments at large scale. Just a few figures. The empty apartments in China reach more than 20% of the stock of apartment of China, 20% at the scale of China. In Egypt, it reached more than 30%, go from 25 to 30% in 10 years. In Dubai, it's 25%. In France, it's only 8%, but it's increasing very quickly. In Paris, in 5 years, in the city of Paris, only the small part of 2 million inhabitants, the empty apartments grow from 14% to 17.5% in 5 years. So we have now in the city of Paris 225,000 empty apartments. And in the same period, we had 85,000 Airbnb that increased in Paris. And so there is a big relation. And why Airbnb is very interesting is because you have no renters. So you can use the apartments like a financial asset, and it's easier to sell it. And so this very wonderful flexibility for the private sector. And we develop a project with investors and based on innovative ideas on ecology with the say appel à projet du Grand Paris for this kind of competition we have with investors and architects. The idea is open and make everything you want, and we'll choose the best project with a very flexible, without rules. And so we go more and more in that direction today for the urban regeneration, which is the consequence of the climate change. Because when we, just to finish, when we speak about climate change, we want to have more compact cities. So we'll focus more on urban regeneration than on urban extension. And then the process of urban regeneration is based on existing owners, on the neighbors, on the people who want to invest on that place. And so it's a reverse system than the urban extension that could be done here. We're based in urban regeneration is based on a complex system of actors with, of course, the local bodies. But just to say that with this, in our system, we're more and more flexible. So there is more and more connection between the different actors. And in fact, with a very huge capacity of investment that we have today, the question is less to create money or to attract money because the money is there. The question is how to regulate this money. So my first question to the two speakers will be, what are the main the main tool we can have to regulate this capacity of the investors to reach the goals for the economic and social and environmental well-being? I was a little bit long, I'm sorry.
Jean-Paul, would you want me to start? Maybe Emma? Or...
Yes,
I'm happy to. Do you want me to start?
Look.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you, Eric, also for your observations on that. And like I said, I'm in dangerous ground here as an economist with a lot of planners around, but let me do my best. First of all, let me, and I think your point that you made about a lot of money floating around the economy is a very important one, but I think also gets is a major component of those structures, which then also suggests that the risks we are dealing with here are not just the risks of the developer. You're dealing with the risks of the investor and the financiers. If anything, the developer has a short-term risk in this. If they do a development to develop and get out, you can argue that their risk is the risk of doing the development and getting out of it. The investor will take a very different view on risk and will take a much longer term. They are holding the property, if they hold the property for rental purposes, and the financiers. So I think that when we discuss what tools, I think we also need to understand the different agents, the different players in this game, and the role that these different players have in this. You see, where it becomes interesting is, where do the tools work? Typically on inclusionary housing, the whole negotiation takes place on because those rights are in place and you will do as you wish. So it also starts being influenced by the type of development that is occurring and where. Now, let me give you an example of where I think this happens. And I see this typically, it's a discussion I continuously have. Public sector is under pressure financially. In many emerging countries, every opportunity to earn a buck isn't quite there, but it becomes tempting to sell land. A typical example of that. Now the question is, and this is the discussion I have, and it touches on the leverage of the public sector in this. Either the public sector takes a view and says, the municipality, well, I sell my land, go and do with it as you please, when we're not putting much influence of it. Or is there a sweet spot for the public sector to move on with, whether it's infrastructure in the next step, not maybe becoming the developer is too high a risk, but is there a sweet spot where you can bring land to the market with a certain negotiating arbitrage around it? In other words, and can you as a public sector play a role in the point that you mentioned, Eric, in the mitigation of risks through your policy, rather than the risk of going through the incentive route where you start eroding your tax base, your rates and taxes. And we know where it comes from. Those incentives are very quickly speed up my zoning period, you know. I don't want to wait 4 years. I want this to happen in 6 months. And I think it is those leverages that become important. I'm not sure if I completely answered. I probably skimmed a bit around it, but this is how far I can get as an economist, probably.
From my perspective, I think that the question was essentially about how do we regulate the money, including the behaviour of investors. And I think Francois' point about understanding the actors, whether their stake is long-term, short-term, and how that shapes their behaviour is a really key one. I mean, traditionally, when we're thinking about things like town centre regeneration, we would expect the public sector to be holding the kind of accountability tools. So they would be, for example, using planning instrumentation to set down goals and use planning instrumentation. So we've already touched upon things like land value capture, for instance, to try and ensure that that public interest is then both represented in what is delivered, but also then there's a mechanism to capture that, given that we now have a very kind of, now that we rely essentially on mainstream real estate development to deliver a lot of our urban regeneration, certainly in the UK context. A couple of things that I would just highlight. One, I actually saw that a linked question came up in the chat about the Dutch context. We're seeing in the UK context essentially an erosion of the powers of planning, a transfer, some over, some under the radar, to the private sector. removal of a lot of the regulatory powers. So you may have been following some of the changes in permitted developments, which effectively takes some of the powers of the state to regulate the change of use in town centres away from this. It takes it out of the planning system in short. So there's a kind of there's a changing of the powers, a more complex system with gaps that that can be frankly exploited. So we hear about the kind of predatory kind of capitalism type mechanisms that they have through those gaps, a kind of means to take hold and create town centres that perhaps aren't as curated or as regulated as we might like, and optimally for the public interest to be upheld. The kind of I don't know if it's a counter to that, but something else that I kind of discern going on. I mentioned in the slide this idea of, are we seeing short-term responses to the crisis involve a kind of relabeling of development as regeneration? It's fairly anecdotal, but one example is we have a retail kind of membership body that represents the interests of retailers, town centre kind of actors, etc. They've recently rebranded their town centre wing Regeneration. I'm also seeing instances of developers, investors adopting the language of, say, social value, and talking about, a bit like that pool example that I very briefly threw up, that is a town centre, shopping centre asset owned by Legal & General, adopting the language of regeneration. So talking about long-term, talking about responsible investment. And actually, I think there's a question, I guess, about how genuine that is, whether that then extends to what we might more broadly conceive of as the public interest. But, you know, even if there is a commercial imperative for that, particularly in a short-term crisis context, essentially these assets aren't performing in the normal way. We've got to do something different. Maybe we're looking to the language of regeneration to say, okay, we'll accept 0 or lower returns, perhaps over a longer period. That's better than nothing, you know, that there is that commercial imperative. But if it creates, even in maybe the short to medium term, town centres that are more diverse, that are better suited to effectively what we want, does it matter? The only other thing I would add is that I think we also are seeing at a more strategic level. There was, for instance, a letter published a couple of weeks ago with a leading set of investors, including Legal & General by coincidence, who were basically urging the government to end their support for fossil fuels. So I think maybe what we're seeing is some kind of development and innovation amongst investors, prompted maybe by commercial imperatives. But does that matter if it gets us where we want, I suppose, is my slightly kind of provocative question. If it gets us a better town centre, albeit we need, yes, that longer term set of structures that traditionally would be provided by planning to make sure that they are sustainable over the long term. But if that's prompting better behaviour amongst government on zero carbon targeting and delivery, if it's prompting better behaviour in the shorter term in terms of creating opportunities for a more diverse set of town centre uses, does it matter if that is being driven by commercial imperatives with a short-term driver? I guess maybe it doesn't, provided you get those then longer-term oversight strategies. And that is where I think still planning has a critical role, albeit in the UK. It's increasingly difficult, I think, for traditional planning sector, public sector planning to kind of enforce that framework because it's being eroded and fragmented in so many different ways.
Michael, very interesting to go a little bit further about the because on planning, because when in your presentation and now you speak about finally the role of planning and the role of planning in a situation where we're facing crisis and crisis every 5 years, every 10 years, we have big crisis. And so it's very difficult to make forecast and so we're in a world where we have a lot of uncertainty. So, but in fact, we can consider also that the type of planning that we have developed in the last 20 years changed completely for the traditional planning from the 60s, and we're more focusing on strategies than on building control. Depends from place to place, but just the example in France, we have a number of strategies. It's completely crazy. We have a dozen and dozen of strategies in all fields. We like strategies. We like that because we are a very fragmented system with very small municipalities, and because the state don't want to have a coherent system between the region, the department, and the municipalities. So this is a mess produced by our state government. But in fact, what is interesting with strategies is that we discuss a lot with all the actors from all sectors, the civil society, the NGOs, the private sector, and the different public bodies, and to fix a common vision, common objectives, and a common framework to develop the territory on which we want to work on. And so so we cannot consider planning as it was 20 or 40 years ago, because today the planning system is a way to build a common vision and to fix common objective with all the actors. So the other question is, how is it efficient, this kind of system, which is more based on projects, on strategic projects, than complete planning system, comprehensive planning that was implemented before, and it is based on monitoring. And so the other question is how to control or how to monitor, we can say better than control, the effect of these strategies, and how to, and is it really possible to monitor when we have weak capacity to follow up or to measure the effect of these policies? Just an example, when all the data from the water system is in the hand of a private company to produce potable water, how can you control the data they are producing? And so there is a lot of interesting things that happen, which is more integrated. So the blurred boundary are there between in the planning system, in the implementation of public services, but the monitoring system is by those who are probably has to be the guarantee for the public policy or the public interest, which is the elected people or the representative of the population, have less and less capacity to control what happens on the field. And so what is your impression about the role of planning and what's the new planning system and how is it efficient?
Look, if I can just add here and respond in saying it's not only the planning system and the economy, but I think we've got a property cycle, which also makes it complicated. And that property cycle, I mean, let me just take the South African story, which we have a major boom every 20 years. 60s, it was about industrialization. So the whole policy was around industrialization. The boom in the 80s was about decentralization, everybody leaving the inner cities. So we had a whole policy framework that started to adjust to decentralized nodes, and we ended up into the urban sprawl arguments. Of course, and then we went into TODs, transport-oriented developments, and policy started following the TOD policy. So and if you just follow right now if you take the last documentation out of the Urban Land Institute to look at a survey, I think that the sectors that we would have been looking at 10 years ago are probably sitting at the bottom of the pile. Shopping centers, offices. What's sitting on top of the pile at the moment? Data centers, right? With a greater demand for having almost industrial data centers, logistics in our urban areas. And fairly quickly after that, you've got hospitals and residential, and so we have a planning system that is now under pressure to respond to how the property sector has shifted. And I think what's becoming very increasing, just from a property economics and from a property market, the whole talk is about, you don't sell square meters anymore, you sell lifestyle, where you'll hear paying, more and more property companies, we're going to look like hotel groups. When I go to a hotel for 2 nights, I don't ask how many square meters do I rent. I'm buying into something, and that the office sector will start doing something very similar. And so suddenly that link between the office and the urban environment that you are offering around that starts becoming of greater importance. And now you start having a discussion around that. More recently, and I think this is where the planning environment is going to have to look at it, there's the whole talk of what's happening to our suburbs. Are we going to work in our suburbs? Are we going to live in our suburbs? So I suppose what I'm getting to is that we also, I think the planning system
My apologies for interrupting. We're losing you also. I'm not sure.
The continuous pressure. Okay, let me leave that for now. I'll leave Emma take it up.
Thank you.
Thanks. Erica, a couple of things that you said really resonated, and that was efficiency. And then Francois, in your response, you talked about how, as part of those claimed efficiencies, the planning system planners have been under pressure to respond to property cycles, I think, as part of that overall claim of efficiencies. And the role of planning in delivering those efficiencies. That's certainly been at the heart of the planning system reforms that we've seen in the UK in previous decades. A certain amount of irony there really is that in delivering those claimed efficiencies by putting the needs of the property sector in quite material ways at the centre of national planning policy, so putting concepts like economic financial viability in there as a kind of consideration alongside other material considerations that the planning system then has to weigh up in its judgment of what should our towns and cities look like, what should our priorities as a nation over the long term be. The irony is that it's created such complexity and fragmentation with the kind of layering of systems, with I mentioned the permitted development rights, which effectively has taken certain decision making out of the planning system altogether. In fact, even the private sector, those that were supposed to be benefiting from the kind of certainties and efficiencies of a more flexible and streamlined planning system, now don't really know what they're doing within the planning system either. So there's a bit of a muddle, really. Eric, you also mentioned weak capacities, and there have been calls from private sector developers here as well to actually resource public sector planning better, because actually, that interface between you and a local planning authority as someone who's dealing with your development application, you want to have a constructive and timely dialogue with, you want to have a kind of system of certainty as part of your kind of assessment of those development risk returns, right? So public sector planning and its inefficiencies is part of your risk analysis, isn't it, as a developer? So in some ways, those kind of claimed kind of streamlinings of the UK planning system, and I'm very much sort of self-consciously speaking from that perspective, haven't been particularly effective in many ways. I think it's also getting increasingly difficult to clarify, well, exactly what is public sector planning, again, in a UK context. I did a piece of research with two of my colleagues at the University of Reading looking at local plan making. So this is one of the strategic instruments that local planning authorities have to produce, and it deals with the kind of strategic issues that you would expect a local plan to deal with. Where are you going to put your houses? You know, how are you dealing with issues around sustainability? What's your kind of travel and transport priorities, etc. It's that strategic future thinking look, and partly because of the incapacities that years of austerity in the UK have produced, with particularly deep cuts to planning as a kind of potentially not as essential service as maybe, you know, social care and education and so forth, has been that there have been very deep cuts to planning sectors, and public sector planners, you know, consultants are now producing a lot of that information. Eric, I think you talked about this in the instant in a slightly different example. So it becomes very difficult to actually say with confidence, certainly in a UK context, what is planning? You know, it is now that is a hybridized kind of gathering of public and private individuals. So a lot of the evidence gathering that is being done to then create plans is being commissioned through private sector consultants. It's then being assembled by public sector planners. So there's a kind of oversight role, but actually, you know, who is where is that information coming from? And the process, of course, of assembling it is a political process in of itself. So bit of a rambling answer, but it really does get to the kind of, it does get us to the crux of the issues here, really, which is, you know, what is planning? Really.
Emma, if I could just add to that, I think it even gets worse, because and if I look again from the context where I come from on this continent, you end up with a city with its darling projects acting as a property player itself, and often negating its own policies. You know, it's got a piece of land and that it decides it wants to develop, and this tendency at the moment of city planners, well, not even the planners necessarily, but somewhere in the city, the development companies, property companies sprouting up, with the city playing its role, and often not a role that different to what the private sector would do with that exact. And then the words highest and best use gets used, and value gets attached to that. And you have a city trying to convince itself that it shouldn't walk out with the highest amount of money that it can, you know. I don't know, but I think the planning has got to often, and you are closer than I would be, but to a sort of project-driven game.
Those are excellent insights from everyone. Thank you very much for those. Particularly, what strikes me is the unlikely partnerships and interdependencies that we're discussing between the public and the private sector. I think it's a great moment to take questions from the audience. I've sort of bucketed the various questions that have come in. There's some brilliant questions from the audience. Due to paucity of time, I've bucketed them into three parts, three types of themes. The first, I think, that seems to be coming from many of the participants is various kinds of relationships and interdependencies that exist in this space, and particularly how they're exacerbated by this pandemic moment. The first is about relationships between city governments and property developers, of course, and we've deliberated on that to a certain extent. But what are the different kinds of, and I'm linking this with another set of questions that come from many others in terms of the relationships between these interdependencies and risks. So if you could please throw some light on the relationships between city governments, property developers, elected councillors and developers, and how these interdependencies embed risks. To what extent do these hinder or support social value? If Emma, Francois, Eric, if you could throw light on this particular question, that'd be great.
Emma, do you want to start this time?
Like to go.
Yeah. So we have one of the questions is to what is the legitimacy of the elected people? The election that we had last week in France for the region and the department, we have less than 2/3 of the population don't go to vote. And so this is terrible for democracy, but but it is a democracy, and so their legitimacy is weak. And we can say something different manner, not at the scale, but for the last presidential election, it was something like that. So the real legitimacy of the elected people could be discussed from place to place. But the legitimacy of the private sector to produce social value is really questionable. And so there are some engagement from the social and environmental responsibility of a private company. They take engagement and to show something, but generally it's a kind of green and social washing, and there is few controls, and you have the same with this label, and we're financing a lot of coal industry worldwide. So what is the real engagement of this company regarding the social value and the environmental values? So this is, there is the branding, or there is some tools that we can say it's interesting to for this the private sector to be engaged, to be aware about these concerns. But in fact, if there is no specific framework like constraints with regulation or subsidies or financial support to change the business model, nothing will happen. Just an example, which is not in the real estate field, but it is in agriculture, for the biodiversity development. We use some ambassadors who are farmers. We change their system of production, which is completely bio and going in and they make profit, and they explain to the other how to change their system. So they have economic return, which is similar than the others with a completely different system. And so just this kind of example is useful, but the main constraint they have is to change their framework, and for that they need investment at the beginning, which is supported by the European Union and the French government. If there is not that, nothing happens. After that, we should have some people who convince others, who have the legitimacy to convince others to change their business model. So how we can have something similar to make profit, because private sector is there to make profit. What are the conditions? What is the framework? And who are the actors that are able to change the mindset of these actors, but not to make greenwashing or social washing, but to make real profit in better with another business model. Is it possible?
Emma, would you like to respond? And I'd like to request you all to be brief. We have another round of questions as well.
Sure. Yeah. Well, just to reflect on those sort of relationships at the sort of city, urban, town scale, from the Bracknell instance, I think a lot of it comes down to behaviours. So I think one thing that we've seen, particularly in urban regeneration, where you know, the risks may be bigger, the returns may not be quite so clear. There's potentially a bit more to be invested, perhaps than in a kind of regular mainstream real estate development context. I think that puts even more imperative on behaving in the right way. And I think one thing that we've seen is local authorities, partly through that context of austerity and a kind of sense that there is no other way to deliver regeneration at scale in its complexity than in partnership with the private sector, is that it has pushed local authorities perhaps to behave in ways that maybe go fishing for kind of investment opportunities or make those investment opportunities visible. And I think that's created behavioural issues in that a lot of the time local authorities may not be actually that well equipped to behave like that. I think in the Bracknell case, what it benefited from was almost a very clear consensus that regeneration needed to happen. Everyone had kind of, with some exceptions, bought into that vision. There was a lot of political stability in terms of the operation of the council over time, which meant that there were the same people involved in the project for years and years. But where I think we've got local authorities in flux with issues around capacity, perhaps with people with the wrong kind of skill sets, frankly, for what local authorities are being asked increasingly to do, I think that's where we see problems. And we did have an instance recently in Liverpool where there was basically corrupt behaviour going on. And I do think that goes back to Eric's point about legitimacy. The proper process has to be followed. There has to be steps. This deal making can't be behind closed doors, actually, when this is about redoing a town centre or delivering projects that impact upon lives for generations. There is such a clear public interest benefit that if we're going to ask local authorities to behave a bit like developers and investors and or go fishing for that, there's got to be proper transparency processes attached to that. And that's where I think maybe we're a little bit behind the curve. I think the realities of deal making are kind of here, and the governance processes that we've got are lagging a bit behind. And that's where I kind of worry a little bit.
Francois?
Yeah, look, I just want to emphasize what Emma said. And of course, in an emerging country context, it just gets worse. It gets much, much worse. Where it becomes interesting, if I just take a value capture examples, yes, there is pressure to pay for infrastructure. Yes, it does sound tempting to say, let's get some of that from the land values and developers. But even in a country like South Africa, maybe 2 of our municipalities would be able to would have the expertise to even deal with something of this. So I think we're also coming to a view where, through the financialization of what we're doing, there are more and more sophisticated instruments brought to the table, which become very difficult for planners and the public and those involved in the public sector to actually deal with. And I think that there you run the risk of being walked over. And the moment, and I suppose what often happens, the moment individuals feel that they're being walked over, the whole thing comes to a bitter end, which is sometimes not a bad thing, but it's sometimes it's not what you want to do. It's like, I don't understand this, and that's the end of the meeting. And I think that you run, so the building of institutions, and I think, Emma, the point you were making also around the skills sets of planners, but on the flip, look, I'm the first one to say on the flip side as well. When you go through a property studies program and you spend your whole life looking at Excel spreadsheets and IRRs, you also come in with a certain view of how you're going to negotiate things. And I think that's going to be the challenge, that we build the institutions that can actually deal with that. And I want that. It makes me nervous that sometimes in the planning environment, well, not even the planning environment, the sort of deals that are coming from the West, are sort of, hey, here's a good idea, let's bring that across. We all know that local context can make it very, very difficult and lead to the wrong. And when it really gets wrong, that last slide that I showed, we end up with scaled up buildings and cities, and I don't want to be unkind, but there's a whole business out there of people who, whether the development actually happens or not, doesn't matter. There's enough money to be made in the first half of the process. But that's the more cynical view of it, I guess. Thank you.
We have one last question, and it's an important one, on the disposition of this new state as an entrepreneurial one. Any quick thoughts on these? I know it's not a quick question, but any quick thoughts from all the participants on the role of the state that's partnering with private sector agencies and deal making with them? Is it an entrepreneurial state we're discussing?
I think that, and again, in an emerging country context, it's very tempting for the state to become a player, to build up its rates and taxes. Give me that building. It's going to give me rates and taxes. Go for it. You know, we will write off part of our city, and if that's the income generation part, we're going to close our eyes and let it sprawl, and let's build that next thing out. So I think there is a temptation. There's an increasing temptation for cities to play their role with the land that they have. It's very tempting to sell the land, to sell it at the highest price. I think a point that I've made as well. And I think there are dangers increasingly around that world. And it also affects the behavior that comes through, where one sees the entrepreneur. Look, I've got nothing wrong, you know, as an economist, the entrepreneurial spirit, but you've got to know why you're doing it and the risks that you have of projects, the unfinished projects that society has to live with often.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that yes, there's a temptation, but I think, you know, that the kind of constrained finances, to put it bluntly, in the private sector over the last few decades have engendered a sense of, well, I'm not going to get my affordable housing any other way. So, you know, kind of getting it through development viability negotiations and setting my policy at 50%, but then actually on a case-by-case basis, I recognise that actually that falls flat, and so I'll take what I can get. I think that has predominated. So I think, yes, maybe there's been an entrepreneurial mindset. Sometimes that can be positive. The collaboration can work. You can get great places from it. But I think there is a risk that it is a bit of a race to the bottom, because I think that there's a sense that there's no other way to get that, you know, that social infrastructure. I think the reason for optimism is that I do think we are seeing maybe because there's actually sometimes a commercial benefit in doing that. And that was the point that I made earlier. You know, does it matter if it's a commercial kind of imperative to say we're going to deliver town centres that are better at generating non-monetary, i.e. social value? So that's where I think there is maybe some grounds for optimism, but I do think we need those sort of regulatory systems to sort of wrap those two things together and make sure that there is then the proper oversight and systems and checks and balances and so forth. And that's
Eric, one brief response. We have less than a minute actually to.
Okay, so I like to finish with an optimistic view on this connection between the different actors, because we have no choice, in fact, facing crisis and facing the big change of the economy with the dominant financial economy, which is very different than what we had 30 years ago. And so the main question is probably at the scale of the state government is how to regulate this finance and how to produce the tax system and the orientation of this finance to go in the place we need, or in the sector we need to develop the well-being of the population.
Thank you very much. I have a last reflection over here. what emerges from this discussion is that we're in a moment where we no longer can take the liberties of viewing state and market relationships in binaries. It's imperative that we start looking at responsibilities and the behavior of both these institutions and their relationships with the society in mutually accountable ways. So with that, we'd like to thank you all very much. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Eric. And thanks very much to all the participants on behalf of YouGovern for this excellent webinar. Such a great opportunity. Thank you very much, everyone.